Welcome everyone. Good morning to all of you. We wanted to get started on time. We have a long day ahead of us. Welcome to the T20 meeting on global economic governance. My name is Akshay Mathur. I'm the Director of Research here and also a Fellow for Geoeconomic Studies. On behalf of Gateway House, I welcome all our think tank participants, as well as the special invitees today. A very warm welcome to Honorable Dr. Arvind Panagariya, who has very kindly agreed to give the keynote address today. I also welcome His Excellency Mr. Lu Jingsong, Charge d'Affaires, Embassy of the People's Republic of China, representing the presidency of G20 in 2016. Welcome. I welcome Professor Zhu. He's representing the Chinese think tank Institute for World Economics and Politics, which is part of China Academy for Social Sciences. They are the co-hosts with Gateway House for this meeting, so a very warm welcome to you. Professor Zhu from IWP is accompanied by my counterpart, Huang Wei, who is here somewhere in the audience, who has made this possible and worked very hard with me in organizing this, so thank you very much, Wei. IWP is also associated with, is also accompanied with two other Chinese think tanks, the Shanghai Institute for International Studies, as well as the Chongqing Institute for Financial Studies from Renmin University. These two think tanks are also co-hosts of the T20 China 2016. So I welcome the representatives of SIIS as well as of RDCY. On days, representing Gateway House is our co-founder, Ambassador Neelam Dev. I also want to acknowledge in the audience, we have two representatives from the Ministry of External Affairs. Mr. Santosh Jha, he is the Joint Secretary for Public Policy and is single-handedly responsible in engaging with us, in energizing the engagement of think tanks. I know he's a known name to Indian think tanks, but for those of you who don't know, Mr. Santosh Jha and his team has energized think tanks and the engagement of think tanks with government and beyond. So I thank him very much for being here. I also want to thank Mr. Alok Dimri. He's the Joint Secretary for Multilateral Economic Relations. He's in charge of BRICS, G20, UNCTAD, and many other multilateral institutions that Gateway House is part of, that India is part of. And I thank him for being here. He will be giving the closing remarks later in the day. As many of you are aware, Gateway House is an independent, non-partisan, not-for-profit think tank. We are focused on issues of foreign economic policy. The members and our membership base enables us to remain independent. We have focused our research on the role of India's business and global affairs. So with that, we have studied international economic relations, global and multilateral financial architecture, and of course, the impact of geopolitics on business. We're engaged with the Ministry of External Affairs, as you can see, but also with Ministry of Finance and the National Security Council Secretariat. T20, this is, as most of you know, G20 is the premier global economic governance platform. It is a body where developed and developing countries come together on the same platform to design rules of global economic governance. T20 is a sub-forum, an official sub-forum for think tanks. And we have many think tanks represented here today. Gateway House hosted the first T20 meeting in India last year with our Turkish counterparts. This year, of course, we're hosting it with our Chinese counterparts, and I'm very grateful for them to agreeing to do this. We have approximately 20 Indian think tank experts that have come from different countries also. We have experts from Turkey, the past president, and Germany, the next president. We have experts from other G20 countries such as Japan, Canada, United States, South Korea, South Africa, and Germany. We've also invited experts from some of our neighbors. Bangladesh and Myanmar are represented here today. Another think tanks will join us, another 10 or 15 think tanks will join us in the evening from Russia, from Indonesia, and also from UK. We have a few special invitees here also from multilateral organizations. From the Vice President of ADB is here, and he will be speaking later in the day. I welcome you all. Outside of the foreign think tanks, we of course have our Indian think tanks. I'm most grateful to some of my think tanks colleagues from Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore to join us today. I'm particularly enthused that we have some Mumbai-based think tanks also here today, especially from Mumbai-based institutions. We have a representative from Reserve Bank of India, from SEBI, which is the Securities and Exchange Board. We have somebody who will join us from Tata Institute of Social Studies, IGIDR, and also from Bangalore. So I appreciate all of you being here as well. The session today is divided into two parts. There's the keynote session, which will begin now, and then there is a roundtable session only for think tanks and select business and diplomatic invitees. That will take place after the keynote session ends. It's a closed-door session under Chatham House rules. It'll be on the Garden View room upstairs. In this keynote session, we will have our four speakers. It'll begin with Ambassador Neelam Dev speaking, welcoming you on behalf of Gateway House, and Professor Zhu Zibo. After that, I'd request His Excellency, Mr. Lu Jingsong, to say a few words. And then we will have Dr. Panagariya give his keynote address. A couple of keynote points, a couple of housekeeping points. The session today is open to everyone, including the media, so please remember that we are live. Please put your phones on silent. And I will remind all Think 20 participants that we will begin the sessions upstairs at 9:45. So please keep that in mind. And I request Neelam Dev, Ambassador Neelam Dev, to give her opening remarks on behalf of Gateway House.
Thank you, Akshay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Neelam Dev. I'm a co-founder and director of Gateway House. It is my privilege to welcome, on behalf of Gateway House, the Honorable Arvind Panagariya, Vice Chairman of the National Institute for Transforming India, who is also the Sherpa of the Government of India to the G20 Forum. I want to thank the Government of India for helping us with setting up this workshop. We are delighted to be able to welcome His Excellency Lu Jingsong, the Charge d'Affaires of the Embassy of the Republic of China, to India, and all the participating scholars. To come to the subject of this workshop, the different rates of recovery of different economies following the 2008 financial crisis made it very quickly obvious that the Millennium Development Goals would not be met. That obliged the G20 Forum to consider a multidisciplinary approach to include a development track. In practical terms, however, it is the finance track that has been moved forward rapidly. The divergent resilience of economies actually poses a challenge for India because while a significant rate of economic growth and increasing financialization are key economic markers, our unique social conditions make it more important to ensure that the development track gets equal traction. No city in India is more suitable in drawing attention to this imperative than Mumbai, where Gateway House started its own journey in 2009. On the one hand, Mumbai hosts the country's top independent regulators like the Reserve Bank of India, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, key financial institutions like the Exim Bank, the State Bank of India, along with major private banks and market markers like the Bombay Stock Exchange and the National Stock Exchange are also housed here. On the other hand, the stark inequality between the lives of the rich and the poor in the city mirrors the reality across the developing world and also parts of the developed world. The obligation to bridge this gap imbues our research questions and the policy prescriptions such that they give equal weight to the well-being of people with the needs of business and the goals of governments. Therefore, our research has focused holistically on issues of global economic governance, international financial architecture, and sustainable economic growth as we study the energy markets, defense-industrial relations, etc. In this context, Gateway House has produced, just last year, more than 200 research articles, participated in 100 national and international meetings, while responding to nearly 130 media requests for inputs from our experts, because we are trying to disseminate our research. Gateway House has also become the only research-based platform in Mumbai that brings together business leaders, government officials, diplomats, and scholars to examine a host of economic and foreign policy issues. That same spirit has helped us to set the agenda of the T20 workshop and the Gateway of India dialogue to provide Indian and foreign scholars, our corporate members, and representatives from consulates the opportunity to interact and deliberate on cross-cutting issues of global macroeconomic governance, commodity and financial markets, trade, and investment. And now I invite you to listen to the contributions of our distinguished participants. Thank you.
I request Professor Zhu Zibo from Institute for World Economics and Politics to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, President. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning. I'm very happy to meet you in the dynamic city of Mumbai. First of all, please let me convey to you the cordial greetings and best wishes of Mr. Zhang Yuyan, the Director of IWEP CESS. On behalf of the coordinators for Think Tank 20 Engagement Group, IWEP, SIIS, RDCY, during the Chinese G20 President 2016, we need to express our sincere thanks to the Gateway House, the Ministry of External Affairs, and the Chinese Embassy in India. I would like to especially thank colleagues from the Gateway House, without whom this brainstorming event wouldn't have taken place. My thanks also go to all of you sitting here for your support and your contribution. First, let me brief you about the main activities of T20 in 2016. During China's G20 presidency, we will host a total of 10 international meetings, including this one in Mumbai. So far, 7 T20 meetings had been held in China and the rest of the world. Among them, 4 in Washington, D.C., Berlin, Geneva, Lima, and 3 in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen of China. The venues for the meetings span different continents, reflecting the inclusiveness of T20. The meetings focus on not only general fields, but also specific topics. Second, in terms of T20 intellectual and information support for the G20, we plan to submit a policy report and summer briefings of all kinds of meetings to the G20 Sherpa track. The questionnaires, survey, and all types of academic exchanges form the foundation of the final T20 policy report. Our questionnaires cover key G20 issues and are distributed to more than 200 scholars who participate in T20 events. The policy report is still being drafted. In addition, the Chinese coordinators for G20 in 2016 are also compiling relevant literature as supplementary intellectual support. Third, we are also working for the publicity of G20. Efforts are made to promote public awareness of G20 corporations and T20 activities. Media are invited to all T20 activities, and participants are encouraged to interact with media. The T20 website was put into operation in 2015. In China, we have also launched the T20 widget account for the purpose release for G20 cooperation outcomes and T20 contribution. The world economy now shows signs of recovery, but still faces many destabilizing factors. Since 2015, the global economic growth has displayed further divergence among advanced economies and emerging economies. This has increased difficulties in macroeconomic policy coordination among G20. This meeting will focus on 4 aspects: how to seek mid to long-term economic growth dynamics in the post-crisis era, how to build a more stable and vibrant financial market under the current international monetary system, how to enhance infrastructure connectivity to realize green growth and implement the Agenda for Sustainable Development 2030, how to follow the trend of global production network and steer the global economy towards greater openness and cooperation. Dear friends, India is a pair among the emerging and developing countries and has made remarkable economic growth achievement. T20 Mumbai meeting will be an important window for our understanding about India. The G20 has put us together and facilitated our cooperation. Only by doing so can we bring unlimited vitality and bright prospects for the world economy. In conclusion, I wish this meeting a full success. Thank you.
I request His Excellency Mr. Lu Jingsong to give his opening remarks on behalf of the People's Republic of China.
Dear Ambassador, dear Professor Zhu and Professor Panagariya, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, namaste. On behalf of the Chinese Embassy and the Consulate General in Mumbai, I would like to extend my warmest congratulations for this great event. I think this event highly reflects the China and India, our booming relationship, and will contribute a lot for the coming, not only the G20 summit, but also the India will be the host, the BRICS summit. I think today I will share some key words with you about this coming G20 and this T20 event. The 4 key words is like that: history, the development, reform, and the collaboration. For the history, I think the coming G20 summit will open the new historical chapter for all of us, because the host city, Hangzhou, is a very nice and historical city. About 8,000 years ago, Hangzhou and its surrounding area is a very civilized area and is the earliest cultivated rice in the world. And some 800 years ago, Hangzhou is the capital of the most open and prosperous commercial dynasty in China. It's called the Nansong dynasty. It's very, very high reputation for its culture, and it's for the international trade. And 38 years ago, Hangzhou and the surrounding area, Zhejiang and coastal area, is a pioneer for Chinese opening up and reforms. And even today, we say the Zhejiang people are very, very advanced people for the business, and their spirit for overcome all kind of hardships. As we know, the Hangzhou is right now the base headquarters of the Alibaba. There's many, many young teenagers. They work so excellent. They do their innovation works. And this also becomes a new platform and for Chinese and India, teenagers, young guys, to have their joint efforts for innovation. And 8 years, we know, is the start for the G20. The G20 is born in the raging waves of financial crisis, and with the joint efforts, we succeed in stopping the further spread of the crisis. So, both the history and reality tell us that a flourishing civilization requires tireless pursuit of the reform and innovation and the fearless spirit to the fight all difficulties. This applies to China and also as well as the world. G20 Hangzhou Summit will hold in the September 4th to 5th. The theme of this summit is towards innovated, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive world economy. I think, above all, development is the first of all. The President Xi Jinping has said that to the people of all countries, development bears on their survival and hope, and symbolizes their dignity and rights, and we need to ensure equitable development to make access to the development all more equal. And similar as he said, Prime Minister Modi also said recently that development is the only way to empower the poor. So as the biggest developing country in the world, China is keen to see development issue receiving great attention and input from the G20. I think this coming G20 will be the most, gives the most input, biggest input and intention for the development agenda. Not only we put the agenda of the 2030, but also we will invite many of the developing countries to show the representatives for the developing world. And also we have the special topic for the industrialization for the African countries. Under all the topics, we have this kind of themes of development, this kind of element. I was told from the India friend, he said, according to some kind of survey, the cost of raising a coal per day in EU countries is about $2 US. And it's even higher than the average living cost of a man in many developing countries, even in China and India. So it's totally different for the meaning of the subsidiary. It's when they're talking in WTO subsidiary, it's totally different. Some of the subsidiary is just for survival for the most poor person, but some of the subsidiary is a substitute to the luxury rich person. So I think it's totally different. Different countries have different development agenda and different development problems and the development rights. Therefore, we should too stick to the principle of common but different responsibility on the development issues and put more emphasis on the 4 or 3 A's is affordability, accessibility, and availability. Is most important for our developing countries, and both technical and financial assistance from developed countries to developing countries. I think reform also very, very important. Our world economy is facing with all kinds of problems, including downward pressure, slowing growth, flagging trade and investment, and the most exhausted policy tools, as well as market turbulence. Under such circumstances, it's quite crucial for every country to have the far-sighted view and unshakable determination to carry out economic structural reform, even at a big cost. Both China and India are at the forefront of this movement. The leadership of our two countries have such vision, decisive courage, and agenda for the structural reform and win people's full support. If China and India could keep this kind of momentum and make steady progress towards and on this path, it will be our great contribution to the G20 momentum. And the third, I think, most important is collaboration. We're still on the same boat. And think tanks is also very important force for our cooperation. And China is working on this new model of think tank system with Chinese characters as we count on their wisdom for the better governance in national development and for the international governance. Today's meeting is attended by many outstanding professors and experts from Chinese think tanks, including the RWEP, CSS, and the Renmin universities. They also play a big part in preparing the G20 Hangzhou Summit. Think tanks have provide many innovative ideas and give rise to the many new concepts and institutions. As you know, some of the right now existing mechanisms like ARRB, like the rising idea, Asia Energy Internet, and the Asia Financial or Banks Association, they all comes from our think tanks and experts. So I do hope that our think tanks could play a bigger role and make great contribution in the G20 agenda development these years and years to come. Finally, for the collaboration for China and India, I think this year will be a very important year for China and India to cooperate in a lot of the multilateral agendas. And China will host the G20 summit in September, and India will host the BRICS summit in October. The timing of these two summits is very near, and our two countries consider the two summits the most important diplomatic event of the year, respectively. During the G20 Hangzhou Summit, we will host also a meeting, back-to-back meeting for the BRICS countries' leaders, so as to better coordinate our positions and guard the progress of the summit. And the agenda of the two summits are also highly relevant. Both China and India emphasize the importance of inclusive development through more infrastructure building, innovation, and connectivity. When the India proposed to host the first meeting of a BRICS Railway Research Center and gave us only 1 week to inform the headquarters, only China to respond very positively and send a delegation, even overcome a lot of the difficulties. So in this small case, you can see how with full support to India to host the BRICS summit. So in conclusion, I also like to quote that in the 1942, that Mahatma Gandhi had said, "We look forward to the day when the free India and free China will cooperate together in friendship and brotherhood for their own good and for the good of Asia and the world." I call on these people of the China and India to tirelessly strive for that objective, despite the current lot of the challenges. I'm confident that we can work together to achieve this golden vision. Thank you for your attention.
And I request the Honorable Dr. Arvind Panagariya, Vice Chairman, National Institution for Transforming India, and India's G20 Sherpa, to give his keynote address.
Director, Gateway House, Neelam Dev, Mr. Jin Song, Professor Zibo, distinguished guests and friends. Let me first express my deep sorrow at the loss of 50 innocent lives yesterday in Orlando, Florida, in the United States, after a very uplifting visit by the Prime Minister. This was a bit of a dampening news last night as I checked into the hotel. The subject today is the G20, and at T20. Let me first begin by saying, really begin by congratulating our guests from China here, who have done a superb job of organizing this year's presidency. We already have had 2 Sherpa meetings, and of course, there are dozens and dozens of other meetings that are going on, and I can testify firsthand that the arrangements in all their aspects have been absolutely unmatched. I did ask Neelam before I came here because it's not often I speak on, or really I rarely speak on G20. So I did ask, what she would like me to cover. So I did get a few tips on what I should speak about. So here is a set of things, a set of questions that really Neelam raised, and I will just use those as the basis of what I'm going to say. As you all know, G20 is the premier global economic governance platform. It consists of 20 members, obviously G20, but the twist is that there are 19 countries which are members, but the 20th one is the European Union representative. The countries that are members, these are the numbers given out generally, account for about 85% of the gross world output and 75% of world trade, not counting the EU intra-trade. If you count EU intra-trade, it's about 80% of the world trade. Roughly, practically all the major countries are members. The United States, Canada from North America, Mexico, of course, from Latin, but also counts in North America, although Mexico sort of goes into the Latin American basket. And then we got Japan, the large members of the original European Economic Community, Germany, France, Italy, Turkey, the 5 BRICS countries, we say 4, but I think we can let stand for South Africa. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Indonesia, South Korea, Australia, Mexico, Argentina, Saudi Arabia, and as I said, European Union. Presidency can also bring in special invitees. Typically these are countries, but they can also bring in special invitees the international organizations. And several of the international organizations are also regular invitees, though they sit through the meetings. There are 2 tracks, Neelam mentioned those. There is a finance track, which is where it really all started. And there is what Neelam called the development track. We more kind of loosely call it the Sherpa track, which is where I sort of participate, represent India. In the finance track, you have the finance ministers and central bank governors meeting. It was originally conceived in 1999, and at that time it was the finance ministers forum. But after the 2008 global financial crisis, it also then was converted into, was upgraded really to the heads of states meetings. So annually now, in the first year there were 2 such meetings, but subsequently now, or it was 2 years actually, there were 2 and 2, but subsequently it has become an annual event. The Sherpa track, or the development track, meets 4 times a year, of which one happens to be the summit. Usually the summit meeting is the last one, although this time rather unusually because the summit is happening earlier in the year, meaning September. And I think next year Germany is the next presidency, and they are going to actually bring it even further forward because they have elections, I think, somewhere in July or so. So next year it's going to be even earlier. So as a result, the first 3 meetings will be followed by the summit this year, and then there will be a 4th meeting after the summit. This is a bit unusual. There are also ministerial meetings that take place. We got energy, agriculture, commerce, and I think also labor now. So the various ministers from the G20 countries meet to negotiate on the issues in these specific areas. And then, of course, we got the fantastic groups, T20. This is a think tank 20, which is where we are today. B20, Business 20. You also, Turkey started last year. W20, the women's group, and so forth. One of the first questions that was posed to me was, beyond 2008, what relevance really G20 have today. Of course, so the crisis, really the crisis is over, but the aftermath of the crisis still remains with us. Growth has global growth certainly has not picked up. And so that issue still remains with us. And that, at Brisbane, this was a big issue where the commitment was made that the countries will each member country will take actions which will, together raise the level of GDP by 2018 by an extra 2 percentage points. And so a lot of countries kind of submitted their country action plans. But that's just an example. But the agenda of the G20 remains quite wide. So let me just, try to give you a bit of a list. It's not just about, although global crisis is what kind of led to the upgrading of the G20 to the leader summit level, the issues are not limited only to the crises. So growth, as I mentioned, that's always going to be an ongoing issue. But number of other issues which relate to the global economic governance, some maybe even transcending the economic governance, although generally with some sort of implications for economic side as well, do come to G20. So you got growth, as I mentioned, then climate change is a major issue which remains a recurring theme of discussion at the G20 meetings. Trade remains at the center, but again, these are issues of global governance, global economic governance, energy, that is another important issue. Anti-corruption, where India has been at the forefront, is also an issue. Food security and employment, yet more issues. Then new issues get added also, and I'll also talk a little bit about that as I speak about what is going on under the current Chinese presidency. But some of the new issues that have now been added to the agenda includes the Sustainable Development Goals, investment issues, refugee crisis, global health, in particular the antimicrobial resistance, counterterrorism, finance. So it's a very wide agenda, and when we go for the meetings for 2 days, we are in fact very, very busy. We are kept pretty intensely engaged and occupied. One further question that was given to me was whether G20 is being run by the G7. That is the question about whether the developed countries are largely running the show at G20. Let me assure you, not so by a long shot. Non-G7 G20 countries are as tough negotiators as any G7 countries, and India certainly plays a very crucial role in steering the non-G7 positions. So we negotiate very intensely, and not all issues necessarily put us into a confrontational situations, but nevertheless, there are nuances to every issue which can cut across developed and developing countries, and we do negotiate tough. What I found personally, I think my personal experience during this, about 4 or 5 of these meetings that I've attended, is that the very good thing about this forum is that it's a very congenial forum, very friendly forum, where I think particularly to me, since I've been mostly for most of my life a professor, very refreshing thing is to find out that good arguments find lots of traction regardless of who makes them. And that really is a very fulfilling experience. Give and take works. So if you are really always wanting and not willing to give, then I think life gets tough. You can't get concessions if you're not willing to give concessions. So one has to be somewhat in that spirit. One can negotiate tough, But at the end of the day, if you're simply not offering anything, it is very unlikely that you are going to get anything. I think that really, to me, there was the first lesson I learned at the first Sherpa meeting that I attended, and was very happily surprised that when I gave a concession on an issue on which I could give the concession, I very quickly was rewarded with something in return. And that is the spirit in which we negotiate. Prime Minister has been, in this respect, very encouraging. His view generally is that we should not be obstructionists as often we are accused of doing. So I think we do, and I'll give you lots of examples as I go forward and describe some of the experience. The key lesson that I have learned really is that if, in a negotiation, you have to confine your negotiation within the negotiating space. Sometimes if you really want to ask for concessions that are outside of the negotiating space, then that gets a bit tougher. Next issue was about the Chinese presidency. I've already mentioned my general comment that this has been an extremely well-run show, and sure enough, China is setting a very tough example for India. Because at very high standard for India. Remember that in either 2018 or 2019, India would be the host for G20, would be hosting G20, so it will be the presidency then. It is still not clear whether it's going to be 18 or 19, but certainly one of those 2 years. China has sought to give new direction to ongoing issues while also placing new issues on the table. So, for example, growth is an ongoing issue, but here China has given a new direction to it. China has brought in issues that were not a part of the discussion on growth previously, and in particular, China has focused on 3 new areas: digital economy, innovation, and new industrial revolution. And that is now at the center stage of the discussion, and it really sits very well for China, because that is where China is heading, but it also sits very well for India, because that's where India has some strengths, and that is also an issue for the global economy, really, because we are all now moving towards a much more innovation-driven digital economy, with the new industrial revolution likely to be happening in the next coming few decades. Among the new issues, as an example, you got the Sustainable Development Goals. These were negotiated in the United Nations, but have now been brought centrally also into the G20 discussions by China. China has also put the investment issue on the table. This was not a part of the discussions before. In particular, and this is really sort of speaks to where China kind of currently sits. It's a bit between the developing and the developed. That China is not only now the recipient of large foreign investment, but it is also investing abroad, just as India is too, but China perhaps much more so. And therefore, I think it is a natural thing for China to want to then lay down the work, the foundation for possibly new rules on investment as we go forward. So this is a major issue that has emerged in the Chinese presidency. Then there are also issues that get driven by perhaps not necessarily the presidency, but other members. Global health in the context of the antibiotics is one such issue. We also, I should say, that try to avoid duplication, and whereas therefore the Sustainable Development Goals are on the G20 agenda, It is not in the same sense that it is on the agenda of the United Nations. What we try to do is we focus on where the collective action matters, where therefore the G20 can add some value to the subject. So things like infrastructure finance, food security and nutrition, remittances, international tax cooperation, energy, trade. These are the areas in which sort of collective action can help promote the SDGs, and so that's what the presidency is focusing on. So that's some rough flavor for what is happening currently under the Chinese presidency. Briefly, let me speak to the role of India, and this is where I can perhaps tell you a little bit about on my own personal experience. Also, perhaps that can highlight a little bit of the role the non-G7 countries play in the G20. So we have certainly played a very critical role of articulating the interests of emerging market economies in the G20 discussions. I have excellent working relations with South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. We also have great partnership with Argentina. This was particularly true, so this great partnership worked out with Argentina during the Antalya summit. We worked very closely, and that as I will describe shortly and briefly, turned out to be extremely fruitful. We also work with Brazil, China, Russia. So there is a group, a subgroup within the G20 called the emerging market economies, of which these countries are members, and Turkey has just joined as the member of that subgroup as well. And so, where we don't always agree necessarily on every issue, but issue-wise, wherever we see the scope for partnership, we try to do that. And that is also true in some of the cases with the other countries, including sometimes Japan, like on clean coal. We could have some partnership with Japan, so we work that. And the views that we air at the meetings are often echoed back by other countries at the Sherpa meetings. Let me just, get to a little bit of, I'll tell you a few details. The Antalya Leaders Communique, which I negotiated on behalf of India, that had everywhere India's stamp on it, and I'll tell you a few details. The developed countries had demanded a much stronger and also sort of assisted by the ILO, had wanted a very strong language on the harmful effects of inequality on growth. And I sort of felt that, look, that overemphasis on that then can have adverse implications for what you would do for growth. I mean, in a way that can, in an odd sort of way, lead you to actually take steps where you would compromise growth. So I strongly argued, and based on very empirical evidence. So if you know the empirical evidence, then it's harder for the other side to push you. And based on empirical evidence, I argued that, look, this relationship between inequality and growth was weaker. So the language that in the end went into the summit, into the communique was somewhat weaker than what the developed countries had pitched for. International labor mobility, there was again an effort by some of the countries to keep a reference to international mobility out of the communique. I insisted, and some countries supported us. So international labor mobility was very much a part of the communique. There was also references to a new acronym called LIDC. This is the low-income developing countries. And the way LIDC are defined is India and Indonesia, who are members of G20, are not counted among LIDCs. And I felt very strongly that on any of the trade issues, we already had a different terminology, the least developed countries and developing countries. And so you cannot really kind of start using a different classification to define trading rights of the countries. And insofar, for example, we have the special and differential treatment provisions in the WTO. They apply to in relation to the developing countries or the least developed countries, and that is how it should remain. So we ensured that when the references to LIDCs are made, they are made not in the context of trade issues. So that also went in. The United States had pitched very much that the references to the Doha Development Agenda not be included in the communique. We had insisted that the references ought to be there. So the very pointed reference to the Doha Development Agenda did remain in the communique. On energy, the United States had pushed very hard that we adopt some sort of medium-term deadline to end all the fossil fuel subsidies. While India has been making huge progress on fossil fuel subsidies, having deregulated the price of both diesel and petrol, and in other areas made coal cess, etc. We've made lots of progress in cutting subsidies on fossil fuels. Nevertheless, we know also that our states subsidized farmers on electricity, and also on fertilizer we got some of the subsidies that go in, and so we really were not in a position to accept a deadline, and that deadline was therefore kept out. I think the toughest negotiation I had actually in Antalya was on climate change. This was a negotiation on leave aside all the other issues. Climate change issue actually on its own took 2 very long nights. On the first night, we negotiated for almost 9 hours, could not come to an agreement. And at the end, I think what was then therefore put out, that was in a way for the Sherpa trek the last day of negotiations. So finally, the Turkish presidency kind of decided to put a particular weak paragraph on which there was no difference. But the next day, actually, many of the leaders, particularly in the developed countries, objected to that, and so therefore the Sherpas went to work again that night. So there's the first day of the summit itself. Then, when around 10 at night, we went back to work, and that sort of went negotiation again went till all the way to 4 o'clock. The difference, I think broadly, I would put out the way I can tell you is that the difference was that France in particular, but supported by the United States, United Kingdom, etc., was very keen to actually achieve some of the, or cross some of the hurdles that had to be crossed in Paris, where the actual negotiation on climate change was due to happen. France wanted to sort of tie up some of those issues in Antalya, and I was of the view that, look, that's a negotiation to happen in Paris. So we really, it was a very tortuous negotiation, but in the end, we successfully maintained the status quo, so that when our negotiators arrived in Paris, they arrived without their hands tied in any way. So it gave them greater negotiating space. So perhaps the most satisfying thing in all this is that although we did negotiate quite tough, at the end of the day, we did it in a very congenial manner, giving our arguments, and at the end, therefore, you heard not a single nation accuse us of being obstructionists. So I think this was a change for the better from what one had experienced in the past. Lastly, let me take 1 or 2 more minutes. I was also asked, what T20 can do. I think let me say there that a lot of the intellectual work for the G20 is done by the international organizations. These include particularly the OECD, the foremost, I think tends to be most active, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, FSB, the Financial Stability Board, World Trade Organization, and ILO. These are the main ones. Right now, China has also invited UNIDO, I think. United Nations, of course, also sits there. Many of these international organizations are in a natural sort of a more attuned to the issues of issues that are of interest to the developed countries, therefore to the G7. And I think really this is where the T20 could fill a major, major gap. One also needs to, look at the issues that are of interest to the developing countries. So therefore, help identify what positive demands can countries like India and China make at the negotiating table. We are still, I would say that, on balance, a lot of the negotiating issues actually get put by the developed countries. We then react. It is changing. I think, we have been putting some of our own issues, like we talked about the remittances, the international labor mobility, etc. So we have tried to bring in the issues of interest to the developing countries to the table. But I think still the balance is that more issues come from the G7 countries. And I think this is where it's very important. If you're going in a negotiation and you simply react, that's not so good. It is good to identify what we want out of a negotiation, and I think this is where the T20 can really be helpful. Specifically, let me just say, I mentioned to you that perhaps either in 2018 or 19, India will be hosting, and therefore a natural question is that what ought to be India's agenda for the G20 presidency when it hosts. I think that is where you could actually do a lot of work. Help us. If I'm still serving as the Sherpa, I would be delighted to get that help. So thank you again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
We're out of time, but Dr. Panagariya has agreed to take one or two questions before we head to our roundtable sessions. So I know that Elvira, you're at the back curating questions from social media. But do you have a question?
Yes, there is one question that's come through. It's regarding the issue mentioned around international labor mobility. It's one of the topics for tomorrow's Gateway of India dialogue as well. And I was wondering if the panel could say a few words about how that issue of globalization of talents, the movement of labor, might develop in light of things like technology and innovation development, as well as the migration issue coming out of the war in the Middle East.
Let me just say, at this stage, really, we have just put the issue on the table. How is it going to evolve now over the next 2 or 3 years remains to be seen. Our objective, at least my objective, had been that, look, at least sensitize the countries that are recipient countries, let's say the migration, to the importance of it. And there's also the context of demographic transitions that are happening differently in different countries. India obviously is younger, and its workforce is expanding very rapidly, whereas Europe, Japan, other countries, even China actually is getting older. Workforce is shrinking. So that naturally is the context of the international mobility being an issue. But at this stage, I think this is really early. I think we really need a lot of work, actually intellectual work on this. So this is where T20 can be extremely helpful. There are all kinds of various aspects of this, including what is politically feasible. In globalization, as we go beyond trade, there is a hierarchy of issues, and go from trade to investment, and even within investment, the foreign investment is a little easier. As you go down to financial flows, it gets a little tougher. And then we get to labor mobility, it's even tougher politically. So there is a whole hierarchy of these things, but we are gradually kind of moving to the factor market, the movement of the factors of production. investment being the obvious one, but labor is harder. So, but a lot of work actually needs to be done on that.
I believe you're also collecting questions from the floor, right, Elvira? So should I just go directly to the floor, or do you have?
We will bring the mic, so.
Okay, so we'll take one question from the floor because we're out of time. Claudia?
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself before you
My name is
ask the
Claudia
question.
Schmucker. I'm a researcher from the German Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Panagariya, you mentioned that there's already a very wide agenda on a lot of issues, and the G20 always tries to become from a crisis committee to a more global steering committee. Do you think India supports this development, that the agenda is very wide, or do you think India would like to focus more back on economic issues like, for example, Australian presidency did?
Sorry. The question is that would we
There's
want?
always criticism that the agenda might be too wide, so the G20 is no longer very effective on many issues. So, what do you think is in Indian interest if you say you will have the agenda, the presidency later on? Do you think you will support this development, that the agenda is very broad, ranging from refugees to health issues to foreign policy issues, or would you like to focus more back to economic issues?
Yeah, I mean, there is a natural, evolution of these things where widening of agenda is a natural outcome, because we really drop any of the questions, but new ones do get added, and so that sort of explains why the agenda gets wider. But each presidency then, can choose to emphasize. So you can choose your own different emphasis, and China has done very successfully. Turkey did so also. So, when it comes, when it's India's turn, we would hope to do the same, that issues that are of interest to us. You also have to, of course, as presidency, accommodate the interests of the other countries naturally, and you have to be an honest broker. You can't be sort of, just going one way. But still, presidency, because you set the agenda, gives you some leeway. And so, when it comes to us, we will try to play it in a very similar sort of way. What those issues will be, as I said, I don't have my mind made up on that for sure. And this is where I was actually also seeking the help of the T20.
Thank you very much, Dr. Panagariya, and everybody else on the desk. We're out of time. For the Think 20 participants, please remember it's Garden View Room, and we start at 9:45, so please be there by 9:40. There are ushers to guide you where to go. Can I please get a round of applause for people on the desk?